we can transition to the general discussion. So we've got about 30 minutes. Morris.
Well, I am very much interested in this problem that Paul discussed here, because I myself have been working on various problems in stress assignment in different languages. And the most remarkable thing, at least to me, is the fact that stress is really a reflex, I think, of grouping of syllables. That syllables get grouped together in various ways. And when more than one, when there's 2 or 3 or 4 of them in the group, there's always one that receives the high pitch, either the last one or the first one, or higher pitch or some kind of mark of that sort. And what the examples that were discussed in Paul's paper were just remarkable, of all where this accent 2 had always a high pitch on at the end, whereas the other accent had either had another accent in the first or only that one, and so on. And really, it's quite remarkable of the different varieties that this double marking and single marking played out. I mean, I was really quite impressed and interested in that. Thank you, Paul, for presenting that.
This question is also directed at Paul's talk, and it constitutes kind of disagreement with my colleague Lisa Selkirk, I'm afraid. And it's quite simple. I'm completely in sympathy with the diachronic story you told, but there's a place where I get very uneasy, which is, what is de-stressing if it can leave a high tone behind? If high tone was a correlative stress, you de-stress, how can the high tone survive?
Yeah, of course.
You're asking about how is it possible for a redundant feature to become phonologized? We know that that happens all the time.
No,
and I have a story about how that happens. Namely, the redundant feature gets assigned to lexical phonologies, and the trigger of this redundant feature, the context, is removed in the post-lexical phonology. And so this is how we get phonologization of umlaut vowels in German, and all the classic cases work this way. I think you can give excellent arguments for that. In this case, this is just a hypothesis, right? So Riyad actually gives some arguments that it started with the clash environment. So the scenario is you have 2 back-to-back stresses, each one has a pitch accent, then one of the stresses gets deleted in a clash environment, but the pitch accent stays, and then this gets generalized.
If I could follow up really briefly, I mean, I'm completely in accord with the idea of a phonologization of a redundant feature. What's puzzling me here is that it seems it's not a redundant feature, but instead the primary correlative stress that's surviving. And that's a case which strikes me as perhaps unique.
Well, I'm not sure on what grounds to say that it's the primary correlate. That is, you know, we don't know what these things sounded like in Germanic, right? But certainly the bimoraic character of a syllable was a very primary and important fact, and also the Moraic trochee is very well established by means of all sorts of phonological processes, and stress and syncopy and all of those things can be understood if we assume that kind of prosodic structure. So it's just as primary, at least as primary as any pitch accent that might be associated with it, I think.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, my question is about the issue of why phonology is different. Morris, in an article with Bromberger, said rule ordering is a big difference. And so this morning we heard, well, the computational status of what is needed, the machinery that's needed for phonology is lower in the hierarchy than what we need for syntax. But that doesn't answer why It sort of says how they are different. It's not about why. So in connection with what Bill was saying this morning, so my question would be, why is it that these two systems are different? Are we assuming that sort of in the spirit of modularity, that there are two modules, phonology, syntax, several modules, but phonology separate module, and it just happens to be computationally different from all the rest? I like to think of it in a different way. I would like to say, well, you know, the human mind makes available certain computational devices. Some of those we see in certain parts of grammar, syntax. In phonology, we see only a subset of those devices, of those computational things, because phonology caters to something else, namely phonetics, whereas syntax, let's say, caters to semantics. So maybe this is a little bit naive, but still this is what so in this other issue that comes up in why they are different is statements like, phonology is not recursive. So you read in many articles, in phonology you never find syllables inside syllables. All right, well, whether that's true or not, it may actually be a matter of analysis. But I would argue, well, in phonology, in let's say, syllable structure, there's actually a limited amount of recursion that would require an excursion, but I'll spare you that. I have an article on that. And one could argue that recursive mechanisms are available in phonology as they are in syntax, but the stuff that phonology caters to is giving, there's less need to use that mechanism than in syntax, so to speak. So they are different in the sense that they cater to different lords, phonetics or semantics. And if semantics is intrinsically recursive, because our thoughts are recursive, syntax will use that trick and model that. Phonology caters to phonetics, which is more, let's say, linear, more rhythmic, and there's much less need to invoke these types of machinery that make syntax look more powerful. So I'm trying to answer the why question. So I'm trying to answer why is it that the machinery that is needed in phonology is apparently of a weaker sort in a hierarchical sense than in syntax. And I would say not because there are different modules that are somehow innate and that for mysterious reasons have different computational powers, but the computational powers are there in a general sense, but the two different domains of grammar make less use of them. So it's a question and an answer, but I'm curious to see what the authors of the papers would like to say about that.
Okay, before the group, if anyone else feels like it's funny, yes, Bill.
Well, since it's sort of directed to me, I'll say something. It's too bad, first of all, it's too bad that Sylvan left, because I think he wrote the right paper about that one, which was, why questions and how questions. But to speak directly to the question, I don't think that there's any real evidence that the semantic system is recursive in the proper way. I mean, so Paul Piotrowski, for instance, has been pursuing a program for semantics where it's entirely simply compositional. And you can, figure this out just from the fact that we can have periphrastic constructions for syntax where we just lay the whole thing out without using any recursive structures. Right? So you can take whatever recursive structure you want to, and as long as you have pronouns, you can just string it out linearly, right? I mean, and that's actually sort of Paul's program for semantics. So I don't think anybody's proved that semantics is recursive in that sense. And in fact, Paul's program is to show that it doesn't need to be, right? So, that I don't think that there's a difference there anyway. And then I'm not so sure that saying that syntax has to interface with semantics while phonology has to interface with, say, the motor and perceptual systems, I'm not so sure that that isn't a how answer to the question instead of a why answer either, right? I mean, how does it work? Well, it works this way. So it interfaces with this, and that's how it gets to be the way it is. I mean, I think there's a subtle difference between how and why questions, but I'm not sure that that's a why answer, actually. So that's what I would say about those two cases. And Jeff?
Yeah, let me try to make a couple comments. Thanks, Harry, for raising those questions. I do think that the extent to which phonology caters to phonetics and syntax caters to semantics, if that's true, then we should be able to make those connections explicit. So to take the first-last example that Bill mentioned earlier today, where you're requiring the first and last, say, sibilants in a word, or at the word edges, to agree to the exclusion of the medial material, that's an unattested pattern, and it's at a higher level of complexity, and it seems to be unlearnable in these artificial language learning experiments as compared to sibilant harmony type patterns, which are well attested. We can ask, what is the phonetic explanation for that? Or why is the first-last pattern unnatural? And so we could say, well, I mean, and so I'm not sure what the answer there would be. And so if anybody in this room has a suggestion, I'd love to hear it. We know that the word edges are prominent positions, so they're especially salient. And we know that we have sibilant harmony patterns where you can have agreement over long distances, presumably for perceptual reasons. And so what's barring the perceptual system from letting you have first-last agreement to the exclusion of the medial material? In fact, you can imagine a historical precursor for this kind of phenomenon, where you have a sibilant harmony pattern, and then there's, because the medial words are not as perceptible as the word edges, it drops out in the middle, but it remains at the edges. So, I like to believe that the extent to which the phonetics can provide an explanation, it should connect to the computational properties that we're seeing here. And to the extent that it can, I think there's research to be done that can show that the phonetics will predict, that you only get strictly local or strictly piecewise, something to that effect. But that work has to be done in order for the story that you're claiming, that you're putting forward to hold out. The other comment I'd make is to why, and the thing about the why questions is you can always push back one level more. And so I think you're absolutely right that we're saying, look, there is a difference, and then we have to ask the question why. So one of the explanations that I would put forward as to why is because the generalizations people make when they're exposed to the words in their language, the phonological generalizations, are of a different kind than the generalizations that people make when they're exposed to words within sentences. And so I would say that the learning mechanisms are different for phonology than they are for syntax. And that's why we see a different computational characterization between the two classes. So I can't remember what I was going to say. It's very short. So it's just a statement that Gallistel made in the book with King, where he talks about, you mentioned the modularity. And so I think it is, I do think syntax and phonology are different modules. I think the complexity differences is indicative that they're different modules. And I think, that shouldn't be so surprising. So it's, many linguists, generative linguists especially, like to believe that language is somehow different from other cognitive modules. And so, this is the same idea just now within linguistics itself, or within the domain of language itself, that phonology would be different from syntax. And I think the same kind of arguments that argue that language is a different kind of cognitive module than other cognitive modules, the same kind of arguments are being applied here to look at the difference between phonology and syntax. And Gallistel has this nice statement where he says, we don't have a general sensing organ that solves the problem of sensing. We have eyes that can see, and we have ears that can hear, and we have fingers that can touch. They're all doing different kinds of things. There's no general organ that just solves the problem of sensing. And I think that's the case with the phonology and syntax. I think you're right. They are solving different kinds of problems. But then the mechanisms can be quite different.
So let me just maybe respond to Hari's comment about maybe what makes phonology different is that caters to the phonetics, and then the syntax caters to the semantics, and so, and never the two will meet, phonology and syntax, right? Well, I'd like to just throw into the table, actually Morris and Noam were the first to really raise the issue of the relationship between the syntax and the phonology, and there are two ways in which they proposed that in the sound pattern of English. One was with the constituency-sensitive assignment of stress patterns, the nuclear stress rule and the compound rule. And then the other was boundary theory, which I picked up in my dissertation, which was an attempt to provide some characterization of domains of application of segmental phenomena that took into account more general, or at least watered-down properties of the syntactic structure. And so that's been there from the start. This has been, of course, the area that I've worked in, and it's really very surprising to hear talk about there not being any interface between syntax and phonology. It's pretty transparent that there are many types of phonological phenomena that are domain sensitive in the sense that they require information about whether it's direct or indirect about the syntactic structure of a sentence. And we're not talking just about stress rules. We're talking about tonal phenomena, all sorts of phenomena. Now, I raised this morning in response to Bill's talk, and he said, well, we just basically put the edges in there, like, I guess, like boundaries or something like that. But I don't believe that's true. I think actually that, and in fact, there's certainly an emerging research in phonology around the presence of recursive structure that phonology has to make appeal to. And that, in my view, that recursive structure is inherited from the syntax. But phonology does not simply mimic the syntax. And my current thinking on this is that the departures from the domains, constituents, whatever, of the departures from constituency that is semantic is phonologically driven, so that there is a phonological component to the establishment of the appropriate domains over which processes of sentence phonology would take place. So and from that point of view, you have actually an interaction of both effects of the syntax and effects of the phonology in providing the sort of domains over which sentence phonology operates. Now, if people only are looking at word phonology, these questions are not going to arise at all. And this is a problem actually in the field. I think the increased distinction or division between syntax on the one hand and phonology on the other means that there are not young people who are sort of feeling fluent enough to be talking about both syntax and phonology, if they're investigating phonological phenomena, for example. But it's pretty clear that there's a lot of stuff out there that goes beyond, the types of things that you see happening between word boundaries that suggest that it's a pretty simplistic characterization to talk about phonology as just being, concerning segments in sequence and so on. That's my piece.
Continuing the theme of sticking up for phonology, I would just like to observe a very simple fact, which is that in most ordinary discourse, the level of hierarchical richness in the phonology is greater than that of the syntax. In phonology, we have at a minimum features and segments and syllables and feet and words, and probably at least two flavors of phrases, and perhaps hierarchically more than that. And in most simple syntactic structures that people utter, which are a single clause or perhaps two clauses, there are perhaps 4 or 5 significant levels. So not to try to denigrate either semantics or syntax, which certainly have plenty of complexity to offer, but I think the view that phonology is nothing but concatenation of alphabetic segments is simplistic and overdrawn.
Come on, after all. Well, I have
question for Alan Prince that's based on that lecture this morning because I didn't get a chance to ask it, and that was about, and it's related, I think, in the same theme about whether the characterization of formal properties relates to phonetics or not, and that's just whether the formalization in these hypercubes can be useful for thinking about types of diachronic changes that seem phonetically unnatural. So the case I have in mind, I'm sure there are many, but is, you know, the stress changing in Turkish from the initial to the final syllable. And phonetically that's a bit unusual, but perhaps those are adjacent, you know, faces on the hypercube, and that you could think of perturbation as moving you in typological space in a different way than in perceptual space, and whether that formalization was useful for such problems.
Yeah, that seems to me an interesting and natural question to ask if you have a notion of adjacency between languages, and also a notion of kind of size of languages, which has been brought out by Jason Riggle. Because if you have these various regions of various different content in terms of the number of rankings that are included. So you can imagine trying to capitalize on this to see effects in variation or historical change and so forth. And I believe that Paul Kiparski oh, hi. Had something about a historical change where you go to the language which has more rankings. Okay, and that's reminiscent of the paper that Riggle produced several years ago, which had an algorithm for learning which actually looked for the kind of biggest language to go to. So there are these kind of lurking structural things. Now, to speak specifically, so the question would be, now, No, of the ones you can go to that are consistent with the data, pick the one that has the most. So that was his idea, and so he developed a way to sort of approximate guessing how many rankings there were, since you don't want to spell out all the linear extensions of a particular ERK set, though he, in fact, derived an exact formula for at least counting them. Okay, so that's one structural feature you could make use of, and from something that I briefly glanced at, I think Paul might have an argument that fits in with that. But the specific question you're asking about has to do with the notion of adjacency, which comes with this permutation structure. So since two permutations are adjacent, if they're exactly the same except for one adjacent flip, this creates the structure of the permutahedron, which, alas, is not always that of a hypercube. And then, as I discussed, that you can immediately take that to give you adjacency of languages as regions. So then the question is, what can you make of that, since you have those facts? Now, we know, and this is something that I've actually talked about with Birgit Alber, who's thinking about similar issues. We know that just structurally, in the purely formal sense, adjacency is just this adjacent flip, right? But we all know that some have massive effects on the entire word and some have relatively subtle effects, depending on what the constraints actually are. So it seems to me it's an interesting question to investigate is whether the adjacency structure of regions tells you something about what's a likely transition in historical change. And one can imagine other things going with it that also relate to what I was discussing, since the way that these regions group together in classes, like all iambic languages versus all trochaic languages, which in the way I was talking this morning is a simplified typology that has two languages in it. So all these guys are grouped together. Does that mean that we can capitalize on that to use that sort of implicitly hierarchical relation to talk about, coherence within that set of languages, and it's being easier to make some kind of change within a structurally defined unit. This is pure speculation, I think, and one can see the immediate problems in that the notion of adjacency is not keyed to anything in the data. It is not keyed to, because as I mentioned, when we're talking about this, we're talking about a structure which is an abstract structure. And it's very distant from data itself and exists whether you have languages in mind or not. So the question is whether something at that level can have an effect distinguishable from above and beyond the effect of the kind of issues that people typically worry about. Namely, we can have a historical change if one thing looks so much like another that we can ignore the difference. So the answer to the question is, it seems to me like a very promising area for investigation once we have a concept of what the abstract structure of a typology is, then we can try to pursue it. But work on this is just beginning.
I'd like to return to the previous topic for a moment, if I may. I just think there might be some misunderstanding about the, no one, I don't think either myself or Bill is denying the fact that there's a phonology syntax interface with a lot of interesting phenomenon going on. I also don't think we're denying the existence of phonological features or anything to that extent. What we're interested in is the nature of the phonological generalizations and the nature of the constraints. And it seems like what we're saying actually isn't very controversial. So for example, the idea that the kinds of constraints, phonotactic constraints, are going to be strictly local or strictly piecewise or tier-based strictly local is not an uncommon thing. This is the nature of the constraint. So for example, in the Hazen-Wilson Max-Ent learner, what kinds of constraints do they employ? Well, they employ exactly this kind of constraint, the strictly local constraints and the tier-based strictly local constraints. If they wanted to incorporate strictly piecewise constraints, they could incorporate those. And so we're looking at the nature of the constraints, or the nature of the generalizations that exist in phonology. And so I think even though we're looking at the level of the word and we're controlling the domain in that sense, that's the first step to look at what happens in the simple cases. And then I do believe that exactly the issues that are brought up with the syntactic interface and interface with morphology and other kinds of things are the where to go. But you want to start with the places where the picture is the clearest.
Hi. Just a quick question. In all of the discussion today, I was just wondering if there have been any studies or considerations in the role of paralinguistics and stress, not just what's said, but how it's said, and identifying the variations in meaning, not just by the spoken word, but by the written word. I've started doing some self-study. Again, I'm not affiliated with any organization, but I didn't know if there was anybody out there that could throw out some ideas or thoughts on that subject.
Hi. I had a question about Paul's talk also. So recently there's been some discussion of the issue of whether there can be redundant features in the lexical phonology or whether redundant features are only inserted post-lexically, like Landrescher just published a book on that. And well, actually, that's a fairly old topic of discussion, but I was wondering, in relation to the two-stress dialect that you described, is that a dialect which does require the high-low pitch accent to be inserted redundantly in the lexical phonology, or could that be inserted post-lexically?
Well, at a certain point, you have to have this redundant pitch accent in the lexical phonology. I can't tell you exactly when you get to that stage, but that's the prerequisite for phonologization. And the general question is, when do you get redundant features in the lexical phonology? And I believe the answer is that when the redundant features become, they become phonologized when they are no longer co-articulation phenomena, no longer phonetically given by rules that have some arbitrariness to them, when they, for example, function as enhancements of other distinctive features. So classic examples are the vowel difference in Russian between E and Y, which is the most prominent cue for the difference of palatalization in the neighboring consonant. Or in Arabic, the difference between the A and the A, which is actually a redundant property that gives you, however, the best cue for emphatic consonants, which are very hard to hear. Right? So it has something to do with the perceptual prominence and with the distinctive function of those, the function of those features, the redundant features. That's the best I can say. And also, one criterion is that they become accessible to conscious perception. People, Russians, can talk about E's and B's, right? And they are spelled as different vowels and so forth. Although technically in the analysis they are allophones, they're actually functioning for practical purposes as phonemes.
I'd like to try to relate Paul's talk to a question asked by Andrew about 3 questions ago. It concerned the question of whether formal work on the hypothesis space that the language learner faces could serve as some kind of guide for a theory of language change. This goes way back. If you go into the early 80s with parametric theories of stress, we had parameters like directionality and labeling. One thing that struck me at the time is how useless these parameters seemed to characterize the evolution of stress systems. We don't see a stress system suddenly switching the iambic trochaic parameter or switching its directionality. I think a more plausible conception is the one that Paul worked out in his work in the roughly the early 1970s. Under this conception, we have to take into account that the transmission channel is actual data given from the parents to the child. That, to put it in a silly way, parameters cannot be transmitted through the umbilical cord. Right? Rather, what seems to be happening is that relatively small differences in the phonetic signal can, from time to time, give rise to really radical reinterpretations of the underlying grammar by the child. And Paul's Swedish case would be one of this sort. There was a grammar in the parental generation in which many words had 2 metrical feet. It was essentially a difference of stress. What must have been happening was some kind of phonetic lenition of the second stress in the word. And the radical reinterpretation was the loss of the metrical structure and the reanalysis of the second pitch peak as tone. So here we have a case where the parents were talking to their kids, but these conversations had extremely different grammars on each side of the conversation. And that seems to be very typical in historical change, that the phonetic change may be subtle, but the grammatical change can be quite dramatic. So I don't know, I guess that would be my take, that looking at the formal structure of the parameter system is very useful for learnability, but we shouldn't expect it to explain the transitions from one stage of a language to the next.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right, that there's one piece missing. One piece missing, and it's also the piece that's missing in conventional stories about syntactic change. How is it that everybody at stage A converges on analysis A, and then the mythical children at stage B all converge on the basis of the same data on analysis B, right? So this is the problem of drift, right? And the problem actually of convergence in the same direction of languages independently change in the same ways on a similar basis. And so that means that there must be something that's driving the change. And that's why I think this idea of the Rankin volume that was mentioned here being kind of the impetus, so the grammars that, rather I should say, the languages that are generated by more grammars, that is, by more constrained rankings, have a better chance. Just on very simple assumptions that they are chosen randomly, they have a better chance of being adopted by learners. So they have an advantage in historical change. That's how you get drift and how you get the analysis. So you don't want to say it just happens. Okay, that's the just so story that we're always told in historical linguistics. But there's a crucial gap there. We don't get the driving force. Okay.
Does the ranking volume idea explain the convergence point? I mean, does it explain the fact that we're exactly the point that you raised, which was the valid point to raise?
Well, it does predict that for certain subsystems there is a convergence point, in fact. So if you look at word order, which I have looked at, what you have is consistent head final languages and consistent head initial languages. And then you have, perhaps the majority of languages are inconsistent in between. But what you see is constant convergence towards, in fact, in the normal case, to head initial languages. And I actually have a story about why it goes in that direction, but it's too long to tell you. But yes, you do get a convergence point, but most languages, just because of the fact that you can't change overnight, and that all of this can take centuries or even millennia, most languages are going to be in between. And so you can look at this as long-term drift, ongoing in almost every language. Yeah.
The question that I was raising was the issue of convergence of one generation of learners on one grammar, which may represent an intermediate point in the drift.
Oh yeah, but then you have to realize whenever you have change, you also have variation. That you never get actually a single grammar in any generation. You always get variation. The question is what's causing all of the learners to successively prefer one type of grammar over another. I mean, even if you have variation, it doesn't get you over that problem of directionality and change. That is, reanalysis stories by themselves are not going to work. They'll be predicting Brownian motion, okay? And you don't get that.
I was just going to emphasize that change without variation is impossible. It couldn't happen. It's not the case that one generation we have dinosaurs and the next generation we have birds. You need variation within the population at each stage, and in the case of language, it seems quite likely that you actually have variation within each individual, just as a matter of observation.
Yeah. James?
I wouldn't resurrect this argument except that it is a celebration of Morris's 90th birthday. And it seems to me that this argument is relevant to the recent discussion. We wrote a book called English Stress, Its Form, Its Growth, and Its Role in Verse. And what we showed was that there was one, at least what we argued, was that there was one stage in which there was Anglo-Saxon stress, and there was another stage in which there was Latinate stress. And we argued that the reason for the convergence on grammar was simply simplicity. That is to say, it was a simpler grammar to have a Latinate stress than it was to have a lexicon which had was divided up into two classes, one Anglo-Saxon and one Anglo-Norman. Now, what impressed us about this argument was that there was an art form that actually existed for about 50 years. It was the art form in which Gawain in the Green Knight was written, and it was in the stanzas they used Anglo-Saxon alliterative poetry, and in the four-line rhyming quatrain at the end, they used a Latinate stress. So you'd have something like lachanda lotes in the first line, but blanda rhyming with lachanda. So at least back then, our view was the way you converge is just what's the simplest grammar? And this one eliminated an entire category from the lexicon, namely Anglo-Saxon stress. Then it's important in this argument that that art form existed like a firefly.
I had a question for Bill Itzardi, actually. Towards the end of your talk, or I think maybe it was even in the questions period, you mentioned something about how if I understood correctly, the non-context sensitive rules of phonology, or the non-context sensitive part of phonology, could be accounted for by enriched lexical representations. And I don't know if I understood that correctly, but if that is the case, isn't it also a point of a theory like HPSG that something like movement can be accounted for by enriched lexical representations?
At that level of generality, they're analogous. I mean, the specific point that I was making had to do with the representation of reduplicated forms. And so, you know, the question is whether or not the fact that you stop after you've said it twice, right, whether that needs to be represented. So it's well known that the languages, the XX languages, the languages which repeat some string which can be arbitrarily long exactly once, that those languages are outside, in fact, they're non-context free, they're context sensitive, right? But the question is, if you change that so that you say, in fact, I don't care how many times you repeat it, then that's just Kleene star over the, it's just closed under that. And so you're not leaving the regular languages if you do that, right? And so then the question was locating this fact that you only repeat it one time. Where is that located? Is that part of the grammatical statement of reduplication, or is that part of the interface conditions for realizing a structure that is circular? And so the claim that Eric, Ramey, and I made was that you create a circular structure which could give you a representation of indefinite repetition, and that you don't indefinitely repeat it because there's some externalization procedure, the linearization, serialization that takes place when you go to the motor system that stops at that point. Now, I don't think that there's much relationship between that idea and the idea in HPSG other than that there is a potential trade for complexity at one level analysis versus complexity at another level of analysis. But that sort of statement is entirely general, right? I mean, so I don't see the two are analogous but not equivalent.
All right, let's have a drink.